Hi friends, tonight we're setting out on a quiet journey into the rugged mountains of early America, where the lives of the mountain men unfolded far from the comforts of home. As you settle in and let the day drift away, I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time of night it is. If you enjoy winding down with gentle stories from history, consider subscribing for more peaceful tales like this one. In the opening years of the 19th century, the North American continent stood as a vast and largely uncharted expanse. Beyond the edges of the established settlements that stretched along the eastern seaboard of the United States, immense forests, soaring mountain ranges, and wide rolling plains stretched for thousands of miles. These lands were home to countless indigenous nations whose ancestors had lived there for centuries, hunting, farming and trading in a complex web of societies and traditions. To European-descended settlers, however, this immense region was often described in terms of the frontier, a place of opportunity, danger, and boundless resources, where only the hardiest individuals could hope to endure. By the early 1800s, the United States had just purchased the Louisiana Territory from France, a transaction that nearly doubled the size of the young nation. This land deal, known as the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, opened up a seemingly limitless frontier that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The scale of it was staggering. More than 800,000 square miles of land, much of it unmapped by European or American surveyors. For the government in Washington, this represented the promise of expansion and national destiny. For individuals looking for fortune, freedom, or simply survival, it meant a new stage upon which human endeavour could unfold. This new frontier was not a blank slate, despite how it was often portrayed in newspapers and political speeches of the time. The vast lands of the West were already inhabited, not only by indigenous peoples but also by a scattering of European traders, French-speaking trappers, Spanish missionaries, and small enclaves of settlers along river valleys. Yet the myth of emptiness persisted, fueling the dreams of those who set out westward. In reality, what awaited them was not only the possibility of land and wealth, but also the unforgiving challenges of nature itself. The geography of the American frontier was as varied as it was immense. The dense hardwood forests of the Ohio Valley gave way to the tall-grass prairies of the Midwest, which in turn opened to the rugged slopes of the Rocky Mountains. To the north stretched the boreal forests and icy rivers that drained into Hudson Bay, while to the south lay the dry mesas and deserts that extended toward Mexico. Each of these landscapes presented unique hardships: bitterly cold winters, unpredictable storms, floods, droughts, and wildlife both dangerous and elusive. Surviving in these conditions required a blend of skill, strength, and adaptability that few could master. It was in this environment that the figure of the mountain man would emerge. These men, sometimes solitary, sometimes moving in small groups, were adventurers, trappers, and hunters who pushed into the farthest reaches of the continent. They were driven by many motives. Some sought profit from the lucrative fur trade, others craved freedom from the constraints of society, and still others were compelled by the lure of discovery itself. The common bond among them was their willingness to live at the edge of survival, to carve out an existence with little more than the tools they carried and the knowledge they possessed. The economy of the frontier in these years revolved heavily around fur. European fashion in the late 18th and early 19th centuries placed an enormous value on beaver pelts, which were transformed into hats that symbolized refinement and status in cities from London to Paris. The demand was so great that beaver populations in the eastern United States had been nearly exterminated by the end of the 1700s. This pushed trappers and traders ever westward, seeking untouched rivers and streams where beavers still thrived. Companies such as the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and later the American Fur Company orchestrated vast trading networks that spanned thousands of miles, linking remote mountain valleys to global markets. For the men who did the work of trapping and transporting these furs, life was harsh and uncertain. They travelled deep into wilderness regions, sometimes for months at a time, living off the land and contending with the dangers of isolation. Shelter was among their most pressing needs. In a world where nights could plunge far below freezing and storms could sweep across the landscape with little warning, the difference between life and death often rested on the ability to build a secure dwelling. The typical settler on the frontier might have access to a community, with neighbours to lend tools or labour, A farmer's cabin might be raised in a few days with the help of family and nearby settlers, but for the mountain man, often hundreds of miles from any permanent settlement, no such assistance was available. He had to rely on himself, improvising shelter from what nature provided. This necessity gave rise to a distinctive tradition of cabin building and temporary housing, adapted to the realities of life at the margins of society. These early decades of the 19th century were also a time of shifting political and cultural forces. The federal government was eager to establish its presence in the new territories, commissioning expeditions such as that of Lewis and Clark in 1804-1806 to map and document the lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase. At the same time, indigenous nations confronted increasing pressure from encroaching settlers and traders. For them, the arrival of mountain men and other frontier figures represented not an empty wilderness opening up, but the intrusion of outsiders into long-established homelands. The interactions that followed would be complex, ranging from trade and cooperation to conflict and dispossession. Life on the frontier demanded resilience, but it also demanded ingenuity. The tools and techniques carried westward were often adaptations of European methods, but they had to be reshaped in response to the realities of North America's landscapes. A steel axe, for instance, could fell trees more quickly than any stone tool, but what good was an axe without the skill to turn logs into walls that could withstand the winds of the plains or the snows of the mountains, knowledge of construction, of food preservation, of medicine drawn from herbs and roots? All of these were as important as the ability to hunt or trap. The first decades of the 19th century thus set the stage for a unique way of life that straddled cultures and environments. The mountain man would come to embody both the rugged independence celebrated in American folklore and the hard realities of survival in a land that could be as hostile as it was beautiful. His cabin, often built alone and with minimal tools, symbolized more than shelter. It represented the human capacity to impose order on wilderness, to carve out a place of safety against the elements, and to create a home, even if only a temporary one, in the midst of uncertainty. As we look back, it is tempting to romanticize these figures, to see them as solitary heroes in buckskin, moving silently through forests and mountains. The truth, as always, is more complicated. Mountain men were products of their time, shaped by economic demand, geopolitical expansion, and cross-cultural encounters. They lived lives of hardship and many met early deaths, yet their skills, their cabins, and their presence on the frontier became woven into the larger narrative of American expansion. To understand how they built cabins from scratch, we must first understand the world in which they lived. A frontier, both real and imagined, a place of opportunity and peril at the dawn of the 19th century. The figure of the mountain man occupies a distinctive place in American history, somewhere between the realms of fact and folklore. To later generations, he was often depicted as a solitary wanderer, clad in buckskins, armed with a long rifle, and living entirely apart from civilization. While this image contains elements of truth, the real mountain men were far more complex. They were trappers and hunters, yes, but they were also traders, guides, interpreters, and intermediaries between cultures. To understand how they lived and why they mattered, we must begin with who they actually were, their backgrounds, their motivations, and the roles they played in the frontier economy. The origins of the mountain men are closely tied to the global demand for furs in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As fashion trends in Europe elevated the beaver felt hat into a symbol of refinement and social standing, the hunger for pelts grew insatiable. By the turn of the 19th century, eastern North America's beaver populations had been decimated by overhunting. Traders and trappers, seeking new sources, pushed steadily westward into the valleys, rivers and mountains, where beaver colonies still thrived. Out of this economic necessity emerged the mountain man, a specialist in penetrating the most remote regions to secure the valuable skins that fueled an international trade. These men came from varied backgrounds. Many were of European descent, born in the young United States or in French and British colonies. A large number of French Canadians joined their ranks, descendants of earlier voyageurs who had long paddled the waterways of the interior. Some were of mixed heritage, born of unions between European traders and indigenous women, giving them not only knowledge of both cultures, but often linguistic skills that proved essential in cross-cultural exchange. African Americans, both free and formerly enslaved, also found their way into the ranks of the mountain men, seeking opportunity and freedom in the relative openness of the frontier. In short, the mountain men were not a homogeneous group, but rather a diverse collection of individuals united by the pursuit of survival and profit in the fur trade. What bound them together most was their skill set. To succeed as a mountain man required more than courage, it required practical expertise. Trapping itself was a craft, involving the placement of steel traps in streams and rivers frequented by beavers, as well as the careful handling of pelts to preserve their value. But beyond trapping, the mountain man had to master the arts of wilderness survival. He needed to know how to hunt game, how to find or build shelter, how to navigate vast landscapes without maps, and how to endure extremes of weather. These were not luxuries, they were matters of life and death. Yet, the mountain man was not entirely alone. Though romanticised as solitary figures, in reality many travelled in small parties, especially during peak trapping seasons. These groups pooled labour and provided mutual protection against threats, whether from wild animals, harsh weather, or occasional conflict with rival trappers. Still, extended solitude was common. A trapper might spend months in remote valleys, seeing no other Europeans until he returned to a rendezvous or trading post to sell his furs. This isolation shaped their character, producing a kind of rugged independence that would later become enshrined in the mythology of the American frontier. Economically, mountain men were part of a larger system dominated by powerful fur companies. The Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, and later John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company orchestrated vast commercial empires. The mountain men supplied the raw materials, the pelts, while the companies provided the traps, rifles, powder, cloth, and other manufactured goods. Trade was the lifeline of their existence, and without access to markets, even the most skilled mountain man could not survive long. At annual gatherings known as rendezvous, held in remote mountain valleys, trappers would bring their year's catch to exchange with company representatives. These events were more than economic transactions. They were social and cultural gatherings, with feasting, drinking, storytelling, and trading not only with company men but with indigenous groups as well. The relationship between mountain men and indigenous peoples was a defining aspect of their lives. Few could have survived without indigenous knowledge of the land, knowledge of edible plants, medicinal herbs, hunting grounds, and routes through the mountains. Many mountain men married indigenous women, creating kinship ties that bound them more closely to local communities. These unions also facilitated trade, as family connections provided trust and stability in economic exchanges. At the same time, the presence of trappers and traders contributed to significant disruptions in indigenous societies, introducing new goods, diseases, and eventually the pressures of westward expansion. The mountain men stood at the crossroads of these cultural encounters, both beneficiaries of indigenous knowledge and agents of change. Life expectancy among mountain men was often short. The hazards of their profession were many, drowning in rivers, dying in avalanches or blizzards, falling to wild animal attacks, or suffering accidents far from any help. Conflict with rival trappers or with certain indigenous groups posed another danger. Disease and infection, without access to medical care, could easily turn a small wound into a fatal condition. Despite these risks, many were drawn to the life by a combination of adventure, economic necessity, and personal freedom. For some, the wilderness offered an escape from debts, from the law, or from the constraints of settled society. For others, it was simply the promise of earning a living in a world where opportunities were scarce. The archetypal image of the mountain man, dressed in buckskin clothing, carrying a long rifle and sporting a wide-brimmed hat, emerged directly from practical necessity. Buckskin, made from tanned deer hides, was durable and readily available. Rifles were indispensable for hunting game as well as for defence. Knives and tomahawks served countless purposes, from cutting wood to preparing food. Their possessions were few but essential, and everything they carried had to be functional in the unforgiving wilderness. One of the remarkable qualities of the mountain men was their adaptability. They lived at the intersection of cultures, borrowing techniques and practices from both European and indigenous traditions. Snowshoes, canoes, and moccasins were indigenous technologies that became indispensable to trappers. Firearms, steel tools, and woven fabrics were European contributions that altered indigenous economies in turn. The mountain men embodied this exchange. blending skills and knowledge to forge a way of life that was neither fully European nor fully indigenous, but a hybrid suited to the frontier. Despite their relative obscurity in the annals of formal history, mountain men left a lasting impact on the expansion of the United States. Their explorations mapped routes through the Rockies, across the plains and into the Pacific Northwest. Trails blazed by mountain men would later guide settlers, soldiers, and emigrants along paths that became famous as the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Santa Fe Trail. What they discovered and endured paved the way, literally, for the migration of thousands. In the context of American culture, mountain men came to symbolize rugged individualism, self-reliance, and a kind of primal masculinity. Folklore transformed real individuals into larger-than-life characters. Figures like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Kit Carson became household names, their exploits exaggerated in dime novels and frontier tales. While these stories often obscured the harsher realities of their existence, they cemented the mountain man as a cultural icon, a representative of the American spirit of exploration and resilience. Yet the reality of who they were remains essential to grasp. They were not simply loners living beyond society, but participants in global economic networks, intermediaries between cultures, and pathfinders whose knowledge reshaped the destiny of a nation. They endured extraordinary hardship, not out of sheer romance, but because fur markets demanded it and because their skills enabled it. They were, in short, working men, sometimes heroes, sometimes rogues, often both. By understanding who the mountain men truly were, we gain a deeper appreciation of the cabins they built, the trails they forged, and the lives they led. They were neither myth nor mere caricature, but flesh and blood individuals navigating a turbulent world of opportunity, conflict, and change. Their story is not just one of adventure, but also one of labour, adaptation, and survival in the crucible of the American frontier. For the mountain man, building a cabin was never simply a matter of stacking logs and sealing them with mud. Before a single tree was felled or a foundation laid, the first and most consequential decision had to be made: where to build. Location determined not only the comfort of daily life, but also the very chances of survival. In the vast and unforgiving landscapes of the early 19th century frontier, choosing the land for a cabin was a skill shaped by experience, geography, and necessity. The first consideration was access to water. A reliable water source was non-negotiable. Rivers, streams, and springs offered drinking water, provided a means of washing, and supported fishing and trapping. In many parts of the Rocky Mountains and adjacent regions, beaver streams were particularly prized, since proximity to trapping grounds saved days of travel. Yet living too close to a waterway carried risks. Spring floods could sweep away cabins built on low ground, and swarming insects could make life miserable in warmer months. A mountain man therefore sought balance, close enough for access, but far enough for safety. Slightly elevated ground, above the reach of seasonal floods but within walking distance of fresh water, was often ideal. Shelter from the elements was another vital factor. The landscapes of the frontier could be merciless, with blizzards roaring down mountain passes, winds whipping across open plains, and temperatures plunging far below freezing. A cabin set in a valley, protected by ridges or dense forest, offered a degree of insulation from the worst weather. Trees acted as windbreaks, while south-facing slopes captured more sunlight during the short days of winter. Knowledge of the land's microclimates, gained through observation or through guidance from indigenous peoples, was crucial. To choose poorly was to invite hardship or even death when winter came. Proximity to game animals was equally important. The mountain man was a hunter by necessity. Deer, elk, and bison provided not only meat but also hides for clothing and blankets, sinew for sewing, and bones for tools. Smaller game such as rabbits, squirrels, and birds supplemented the diet during lean times. A cabin in a location where game trails converged, near open meadows or salt licks, could mean the difference between abundance and hunger. At the same time, the presence of predators such as bears or mountain lions had to be considered. These animals were both threats and resources, and a wise trapper learned to read the land for signs of their movements. Timber was the raw material of the frontier cabin, and so its availability shaped the choice of location. Hardwoods like oak and hickory were prized in the eastern regions, while in the Rockies, pine and fir provided sturdy logs for construction. Clearing too much forest required labour the mountain man could ill afford, so he sought areas where suitable trees grew close to open spaces, reducing the time spent in felling, hauling and trimming. The density, straightness and size of trees mattered. A forest of crooked or stunted timber was of little use. Selecting the land was in many respects an exercise in measuring effort against reward. Safety from human threats was another consideration. The early 19th century frontier was a contested space. Mountain men moved through territories claimed and lived in by indigenous nations. Relations varied widely. Some trappers enjoyed cooperation and kinship through marriage alliances, while others found themselves in conflict due to trespass or competition. Choosing a cabin site required careful judgment. Too close to indigenous encampments might provoke tension. Too far away meant isolation from potential trade partners. Rival trappers also posed a threat, and secrecy could be as valuable as accessibility. Many mountain men deliberately concealed their cabins, building them in out-of-the-way valleys or thickets, where smoke from a fire would be less likely to attract attention. The practicalities of travel also mattered. A cabin deep in the wilderness provided solitude and proximity to resources, but the furs gathered there still had to reach market. Trails leading toward annual rendezvous sites or trading posts needed to be accessible. Cabins were often built near recognizable landmarks, river junctions, mountain passes or established paths that eased navigation across vast distances. At the same time, distance was both a shield and a burden. Too much isolation increased vulnerability, but too much proximity risked competition or intrusion. The delicate balance of remoteness and connectivity defined much of the mountain man's decision-making. Seasonal patterns dictated timing as well as location. Many trappers built only temporary shelters, lean-tos or brush huts designed to last a single season. But when a man resolved to build a more permanent cabin, it was usually in anticipation of winter. Winter trapping was grueling, yet the pelts were at their prime in cold months. A sturdy cabin meant the ability to stay in place through the snow, with supplies stored against famine. Thus, the choice of land was often a calculation of winter survival. Access to firewood, security from avalanches, and routes to nearby game were all essential. Environmental knowledge was not solely the domain of Europeans. Mountain men frequently relied on indigenous expertise to identify good sites for shelter. Centuries of habitation had taught native peoples which valleys were prone to flooding, which slopes were avalanche-prone, and which forests harboured the best timber. To ignore such knowledge could be disastrous. Some mountain men integrated deeply into indigenous societies, adopting not only survival techniques, but also broader cultural practices that informed their choices of where and how to build. Others, less wise, learned only by trial and error. The land was an unforgiving teacher, and mistakes were often fatal. In addition to practical considerations, there was a psychological element to choosing land. For a man often hundreds of miles from the nearest town, the cabin represented security, even identity. The place he chose became, for a season or a year, his anchor in a shifting and perilous world. Cabins were often small, sometimes no more than a single room, but they were also statements of belonging. To select a site, to shape it into a dwelling, was to claim a foothold in the wilderness. This symbolic act carried weight even when the cabin was destined to be abandoned as trapping ground shifted. Historical accounts provide glimpses into how mountain men approached this process. The journals of men like Osborne Russell, a trapper in the Rocky Mountains during the 1830s, described choosing sheltered valleys near abundant beaver streams, where cabins could be thrown up for the winter. Other narratives speak of the relief of finding a spring of clear water, or a stand of straight timber after weeks of searching. These choices were rarely ideal, but rather compromises, between access and concealment, between abundance and labour, between safety and exposure. In modern imagination, the mountain man's cabin often appears as a symbol of rugged independence, an icon of self-reliance in the wilderness. Yet behind that image lay a series of practical calculations grounded in survival. A poorly chosen site could doom a man to starvation, exposure, or conflict. A well-chosen one could sustain him through the hardest months and serve as a base for profitable trapping. In this sense, the selection of land was as critical as any trap set in a stream or shot fired at a deer. The frontier was above all a place of decisions. Each choice carried weight, and none more so than where to build the cabin that might mean life or death. To understand the cabins of the mountain men, we must first understand the land they stood upon, the rivers and valleys, the forests and slopes, the unseen calculations of safety and risk that shaped every log laid in place. Choosing the land was not simply a step in construction, it was the foundation of survival itself. The image of the mountain man often begins with his long rifle slung across one shoulder and a tomahawk tucked at his belt. Yet the tools of survival were far more varied than these iconic symbols suggest. To build cabins, hunt game, trap animals, and simply endure the rigours of frontier life required a diverse set of implements. These were not luxuries but necessities, each one selected, carried, and maintained with care. In a world where resupply could be months away and mistakes carried dire consequences, tools were the lifeblood of existence. At the centre of the mountain man's arsenal stood the rifle. Firearms of the early 19th century were muzzle-loading. Flintlock long rifles descended from designs developed in Pennsylvania and Kentucky during the colonial period. These rifles were prized for their accuracy at long range, a critical advantage in both hunting and defence. Calibers varied, but many mountain men favoured smaller bores such as .40 or .45, which conserved lead and powder while still being lethal for deer and elk. A few carried larger bores suitable for bison or bear. Powder horns, typically carved from cow or buffalo horn, held black powder safe from moisture. Lead balls were cast by hand using portable bullet moulds, ensuring a steady supply of ammunition in remote areas. Without his rifle, the mountain man was vulnerable. With it, he could feed himself, defend his cabin, and obtain furs to trade. Alongside the rifle was the tomahawk or hatchet, a versatile tool as useful for building as for fighting. These compact axes could split kindling, drive stakes, and shape logs, while also serving as a weapon in close combat. Many tomahawks were traded from native tribes or purchased through trading posts, combining European steel with indigenous design. Their lightweight made them ideal for carrying on long treks, while their utility made them indispensable. A larger axe, when available, was employed for felling trees and notching logs for cabins. In areas where heavy timber dominated, the axe was arguably as important as the rifle. The knife was another essential. Mountain men carried large, sturdy blades capable of skinning animals, cutting rope, shaping wood, and even serving at the table. The so-called Green River knife, manufactured in Massachusetts, became especially popular. These knives were affordable, durable, and easily replaced when worn. Smaller blades were sometimes carried as well, but the general-purpose hunting knife was the standard. For trapping and skinning, sharpness was paramount, and men often carried whetstones to keep their blades honed. In a world without spare tools, maintenance was as important as possession. Traps themselves were specialized tools that defined the mountain man's livelihood. The most common were steel leg-hold traps, designed to capture beaver, fox, and other fur-bearing animals. These devices were heavy, often weighing several pounds each, but a successful trapline required dozens. Carried in packs or on horses, they represented both investment and risk. A man who lost his traps to theft, accident, or river mishap might lose his entire season's prospects. Setting them required skill, positioning in streams, camouflaging with mud, and anchoring to prevent escape. The tools of trapping also included skinning knives, fleshing beams, and wooden stretchers used to dry pelts. Each item had to be improvised or hauled into the wilderness, and the cabin often doubled as a workshop for their use. Fire-making tools were equally vital. Flint and steel were the standard, striking sparks into dry tinder to kindle flames. Charcloth, linen scorched into a slow-burning material, was prized for its reliability. Matches, though available in the East, were scarce and expensive on the frontier. Fire was more than warmth. It was the means of cooking, boiling water, hardening wooden tools, and providing light in the long winter nights. Without fire, even the best-built cabin was only a cold shell. Many mountain men kept their fire smouldering constantly, rekindling embers each morning to avoid the ordeal of starting anew. Cooking and eating implements formed another category of essential tools. Iron kettles and frying pans were heavy, but their durability made them worth carrying. Tin cups and plates were common, as were wooden spoons carved on the spot. Some men carried portable Dutch ovens capable of baking bread and roasting meat. Salt, carried in small sacks or kegs, was a tool in its own right, critical for preserving food through salting and curing. These cooking tools transformed raw game into sustenance, turning the hunt into survival rather than waste. For building cabins, a broader array of tools came into play. The axe could fell trees, but shaping them required adzes, augers and draw knives. An adze, with its curved blade set perpendicular to the handle, smoothed log surfaces. Augers bored holes for pegs and joints. The draw knife, a long blade with handles at each end, shaved bark and flattened timbers. Saws, though heavy, were sometimes carried or acquired at trading posts, vastly improving efficiency. Yet many cabins were constructed with only the simplest tools, axe, hatchet, and knife, testifying to the ingenuity of their builders. Where tools were lacking, creativity filled the gaps, with stone wedges, wooden mallets, or even fire used to split logs. Transporting tools across the wilderness demanded careful choices. Pack horses and mules carried the heaviest loads, while smaller items were kept on the person for constant use. Weight was the eternal enemy. Every pound added slowed travel and increased the need for fodder and rest. This meant that only the most essential tools were brought, while others were fashioned on site from natural materials. The frontier was a place where redundancy was rare and improvisation constant. Maintenance and repair formed a crucial part of tool culture. Files, awls, and scraps of leather allowed a mountain man to keep blades sharp, traps functioning, and rifles clean. Powder fouling could ruin a firearm, so cleaning rods and cloth patches were carried religiously. Broken axe handles were replaced from nearby wood, but only if the head was preserved. Traps could be mended with wire or sinew, though not always effectively. The scarcity of replacements forced an ethic of care. Tools were valued almost as extensions of the self. Beyond the tangible, there were intangible tools of survival, skills and knowledge. Reading animal tracks, predicting weather, finding edible plants and identifying medicinal herbs were as vital as any steel blade or iron trap. Many of these skills were learned from indigenous peoples, whose intimate knowledge of the land far surpassed that of newcomers. The mountain man's toolkit, therefore, extended beyond physical objects to encompass a repertoire of techniques and traditions borrowed and adapted and passed along. The cultural significance of tools cannot be ignored. To possess a fine rifle or a sturdy axe was not merely practical but symbolic. These objects marked the mountain man as prepared, resourceful and capable. Loss of tools through theft or misfortune could demoralize as well as endanger. In the journals and recollections of trappers, stories abound of desperate efforts to retrieve lost rifles from rivers or repair broken traps. Such accounts reveal the emotional bond between man and tool, forged by necessity and dependence. In sum, the tools of survival formed the invisible infrastructure of the mountain man's life. Each cabin wall, each pelt stretched to dry, each meal simmered over a fire testified to their presence. The rifle ensured food and defense. The axe shaped the shelter, the trap yielded the fur trade's profits, and the fire steel kept life's flame alive. These tools, though simple by modern standards, were the cutting edge of survival in a world where self-reliance was absolute. To understand the mountain man's cabin is therefore to understand not just the wood and stone of its construction, but the steel and iron that shaped it. Tools transformed wilderness into habitation, and in their absence, even the strongest man could not endure. The mountain men's legacy is carved not only into the logs of their cabins, but into the worn handles of the axes, the polished barrels of the rifles, and the sharpened edges of the knives that made such cabins possible. The cabin of a mountain man was more than a simple structure. It was a fortress, a workshop, and a home. Its walls stood not because of grand architectural plans, but because of a singular skill, the ability to fell trees and transform them into building material. To cut down a tree might seem straightforward, yet in the wilderness of the early 19th century it was an art, demanding strength, precision, and deep knowledge of wood and landscape. For the mountain man, mastering the art of felling trees was as critical to survival as trapping beaver or shooting game. Tree felling began with selection. Not all trees were suitable for cabin building. A straight trunk was essential, since crooked logs wasted labour and left gaps in walls. The best trees stood tall with few low branches, which reduced the effort of trimming. Pine, spruce and fir were favoured in the Rocky Mountains, their trunks growing long and even, while oak and hickory were chosen in eastern forests for their durability. Size mattered as well. Logs too thick were impossible to handle alone. Logs too thin lacked strength. A diameter of 10 to 14 inches was ideal, large enough to provide insulation but manageable with effort. The mountain man knew his forest intimately, reading signs of rot, disease, or storm damage that would render wood unreliable. Once a tree was chosen, its placement had to be considered. A tree leaning toward a cabin site might be felled to land precisely where needed, reducing hauling. Conversely, cutting a tree near a slope or waterway required careful planning to avoid losing it to a ravine or current. Felling was dangerous work. A misjudged fall could kill, crush tools, or destroy precious supplies. The lone trapper, without companions to assist, bore the full burden of this risk. The tools of felling were simple but effective. The axe, sharpened to a keen edge, was the primary instrument. Unlike the heavy double-bit axes that came later, many frontier axes had a single blade with a flat pole for hammering. The mountain man swung with rhythm rather than brute force, carving a V-shaped notch on the side of the tree facing the intended fall. Each strike removed a chip of wood, the sound ringing through the forest. The notch determined the direction, its depth and angle ensured control. On the opposite side, a back cut was made slightly higher, allowing gravity to take over. The moment of the tree's descent was both triumph and peril, a crashing fall that sent birds scattering and shook the ground beneath. Sawing was rare, but not unknown. Two-man crosscut saws were prized for their efficiency, but they were heavy to carry into the mountains and required a partner. Most mountain men worked alone, relying on the axe as their sole companion in felling. Yet in regions where trading posts supplied saws, or in camps where multiple trappers joined forces, sawing was employed for large trees. It produced cleaner cuts and wasted less wood, but the axe remained the universal standard. Felling trees was exhausting labour, demanding both endurance and technique. A man could spend hours on a single trunk, pausing to sharpen his blade with a file or whetstone. Dull axes not only slowed progress but increased danger, glancing off wood unpredictably. Sharpening became a ritual, part of the rhythm of work, as important as the swings themselves. Sweat-soaked clothing, hands blistered, and muscles ached, yet the reward was tangible, a log ready for shaping into the skeleton of a cabin. After a tree fell, the work continued. Limbs had to be trimmed, bark stripped, and the trunk cut into manageable lengths. This process, called bucking, was often harder than felling itself. Branches were removed with swift chops, their smaller wood saved for kindling. Bark, especially from pine or spruce, could harbour insects and rot. Stripping it extended the log's life. Cutting to length required judgment. Logs too long were heavy and unwieldy, too short wasted material. Each section became a piece of the puzzle that would later be stacked into walls. Transporting logs was another challenge. Without teams of oxen or horses, the mountain man relied on his own strength and ingenuity. Leverage was key. Poles and crude sledges helped roll or drag logs short distances. In winter, snow acted as a natural lubricant, allowing logs to be hauled more easily. Where terrain permitted, logs were floated down streams to cabin sites, though this carried the risk of loss. The isolation of the frontier meant that each log represented hours of grueling labour. None could be wasted. Beyond physical effort, felling trees required environmental awareness. Cutting too many trees from a single area could expose a cabin to wind or erosion. Clearing land also altered animal habitats, sometimes driving game away from the immediate vicinity. The mountain man therefore balanced need with restraint, taking enough for shelter and fuel but leaving the forest largely intact. In this, his practices mirrored those of indigenous peoples, who understood the ecological consequences of overharvesting. Survival demanded sustainability, whether consciously or instinctively practiced. The cultural meaning of tree felling cannot be overlooked. To fell a tree and raise it into the wall of a cabin was to impose order on wilderness. Each log represented mastery over nature, an assertion of human presence in landscapes otherwise indifferent to survival. Yet the mountain man was also humbled by the process, reminded of his dependence on natural forces. A storm could topple weeks of labour, rot could hollow a log unseen. Felling trees was therefore an act of both dominance and submission, embodying the paradox of frontier life. Accounts from the period highlight the significance of this work. Osborne Russell, a trapper whose journal remains one of the most vivid records of mountain life, described winters spent cutting timber in sheltered valleys, his survival tied to the logs he shaped. Other trappers noted the relief of finding stands of straight timber after days of searching, or the danger of felling trees alone in deep snow. These first-hand narratives reveal that tree felling was not a backdrop, but a central drama of frontier existence. In hindsight, the art of felling trees shaped more than cabins. It carved paths for settlements, cleared spaces for trading posts, and provided fuel for endless fires. The cabins of mountain men were temporary by design, often abandoned as trapping grounds shifted. Yet each one left a mark, a small clearing in the forest, a reminder that human labour had transformed wilderness into habitation, however briefly. The act of felling trees, repeated countless times, laid the groundwork for broader patterns of westward expansion. For the mountain man, however, the significance was immediate and personal. Each swing of the axe, each crash of a falling tree brought him closer to shelter against winter, protection from predators, and a foothold in a world where everything had to be earned. The art of felling trees was not glamorous, nor was it celebrated. But without it there would have been no cabins, no survival, and no legacy of the men who carved their lives from the timber of untamed forests. When the trees had been felled, trimmed, and hauled to the chosen site, the mountain man faced his next and most visible task, raising the walls of his cabin. The process was deceptively simple in concept, stacking logs one atop another, but in practice it demanded a blend of strength, ingenuity, and craftsmanship. A cabin wall was more than a barrier. It was insulation against bitter winters, defence against prowling predators, and a visible testament to a man's labour in the wilderness. Building those walls was the very heart of the frontier home. The first step was laying the foundation. Unlike later settlers who sometimes used stone or dug cellars, the lone trapper usually worked with what was available. Flat rocks, if plentiful, could be arranged at the corners to raise the logs above damp ground. In forested areas, shorter logs were sometimes laid directly on the earth, though this risked rot. Elevating the first layer, the sill logs, was vital to protect the cabin from moisture. Care was taken to choose the thickest and straightest logs for these base pieces, since the stability of the entire structure depended upon them. Once the foundation was in place, the walls began to rise through the careful laying of logs. But logs could not simply be stacked in piles. To hold firmly, each log had to be notched so that it interlocked with the one beneath. This practice, known as notching, was the key to log construction. The mountain man might use one of several techniques, depending on his tools, the wood available, and his own skill. The saddle notch was the simplest, carved as a rounded groove that allowed one log to sit snugly upon another. The V-notch, with angled cuts, provided greater stability and was favoured in many frontier cabins. More advanced builders sometimes employed dovetail notches, which locked logs together tightly and shed water effectively. However, dovetailing required precision and saws, tools not always available in the wilderness. Whatever the notch, the principle remained the same. Interlocking logs prevented slippage and gave the walls their strength. The work of cutting and shaping notches was time-consuming. Each log had to be lifted, placed, marked, then lowered to be cut with axe or adze before being hoisted again. Alone, a mountain man might rely on levers, ropes, or sheer persistence to raise heavy logs. With companions, the work was faster, yet still grueling. The rhythm of building was punctuated by the ring of axes and the thud of logs settling into place. Gradually the walls rose layer by layer, enclosing space where none had existed before. As the walls climbed, gaps between the logs became the next challenge. No matter how carefully cut, raw logs rarely fit perfectly together. Spaces let in wind, snow, and insects, undermining the cabin's warmth and security. To seal these cracks, a process known as chinking and daubing was employed. Chinking referred to the stuffing of gaps with materials such as moss, grass, clay, or even strips of bark. Daubing involved smearing mud, clay, or a mixture of lime and sand over the chinking to hold it in place. Together they created a primitive but effective insulation. The mountain man gathered moss from forest floors, dug clay from riverbanks, and applied them with his hands, transforming rough walls into a barrier against the elements. Windows were rare luxuries in the cabins of mountain men. Glass was costly and impractical to carry. Instead, if light was needed, small openings were left in the walls, later covered with greased paper, animal hide, or simply wooden shutters. These let in some daylight while keeping out the worst of the cold. Doors, too, were rudimentary. Planks split from logs or slabs fastened with wooden pegs and hung on leather or wooden hinges. Iron nails and fittings were scarce, so ingenuity replaced hardware. A latch string, a loop of rawhide or cord could be pulled from outside to lift a wooden catch, allowing simple but effective security. The height of the walls was determined by both ambition and necessity. A small one-room cabin might rise only 6 or 7 feet high, just enough to stand upright inside. More ambitious trappers, or groups building together, sometimes constructed cabins tall enough for lofts, providing sleeping space above and storage below. The thickness of the logs themselves contributed to insulation. A single log wall could be over a foot thick, retaining heat and shielding against arrows or bullets if needed. Cabin walls served more than practical purposes. They were a statement of presence. To erect a wall in the wilderness was to carve out a piece of permanence in a world otherwise in constant flux. Trappers who spent months roaming rivers and mountains found in their cabin walls a sense of rootedness, however temporary. The logs bore the marks of each swing of the axe, each choice of notch, each handful of clay pressed into cracks. The cabin was, in essence, an autobiography written in wood. Historical records and archaeological studies reveal much about these walls. Excavations of early cabins show patterns of saddle and V-notching consistent with frontier methods. Journals describe the long days spent shaping logs, the frustration of gaps that refused to seal, and the pride in watching a cabin take form. One trapper, quoted in later accounts, remarked that the sight of 4 walls standing made him feel richer than any man in the cities of the East. The cabin walls were not grand, but they were his. The process of wall building also carried social meaning when trappers worked together. Though many mountain men lived solitary lives, at times they banded together to build. Raising walls became a communal effort, with each man lending his strength. These gatherings mirrored the barn raisings of farm communities, though on a smaller and rougher scale. Shared labour forged bonds, and the resulting cabins sometimes became meeting places or bases for joint expeditions. The walls, then, were not only physical barriers but also social structures, holding within them the fragile networks of frontier camaraderie. Once the walls reached their intended height, they created an enclosure of surprising strength. Thick log walls absorbed sound, muffled wind, and provided security against wolves, bears, or hostile strangers. Inside, the atmosphere was dark and smoky, the air heavy with the scent of pine or spruce. Yet for the mountain man, these walls represented warmth, safety, and the promise of survival through the winter. They turned wilderness into home. In broader historical perspective, the building of cabin walls reflected the spread of European log-building traditions across North America. Scandinavian immigrants had introduced log construction to the colonies in the 17th century, and the method spread westward with settlers and trappers alike. By the time mountain men carved their cabins in the Rockies, log walls had become a defining feature of frontier life. The walls of a trapper's cabin were part of a long lineage, connecting old-world practices to new-world realities. Thus, building cabin walls was more than manual labour. It was a craft, an art, and a symbol. Each notch cut, each gap filled, each log laid in place was a step in the transformation of raw forest into a human dwelling. The walls that rose in valleys and mountain clearings across the frontier stand as mute witnesses to resilience and adaptation. In their shadows, the mountain men endured storms, cooked meals, shared stories, and dreamed of survival. Without these walls, there would have been no cabins. Without cabins, there would have been no foothold for men in the vast and untamed wilderness. Stepping into the interior of a mountain man's cabin was like entering another world. From the outside, these structures often looked crude, rough-hewn logs stacked together, a roof that might sag under snow, and small windows cut into the walls. Yet inside, the space told a story of ingenuity, resilience, and the daily realities of survival on the frontier. Though each cabin was unique to its builder and the available resources, common features and patterns give us a vivid picture of how these men transformed timber into a livable home. The floor of most cabins was simply packed earth. Flattened by repeated footsteps and occasionally smoothed with ashes or sand, it provided a firm surface that required no extra materials. In some cases, where time and resources permitted, wooden planks might be laid down, but this was rare. The ground floor became a living surface for cooking, sleeping and working, often all within the same space. Dirt floors were not without their disadvantages. Dust would rise in the summer and mud would seep in during wet seasons, but frontier practicality outweighed comfort. The walls inside revealed the handiwork of the builder. Gaps between logs were filled with a mixture known as chinking, a combination of mud, clay, moss or straw. This insulation was critical in keeping out wind and moisture. In winter, a poorly chinked cabin could become nearly uninhabitable, with icy drafts cutting through the walls. Successful mountain men paid close attention to this detail, often spending hours carefully packing crevices. The smell of drying clay and damp moss often lingered in such homes, mingling with the smoke from the hearth. At the heart of every cabin was the fireplace. More than any other feature, the hearth defined the interior environment. Constructed from stone or clay, it served as the primary source of heat and the centre for cooking. A cabin without a well-built fireplace was incomplete. In fact, many men would select their cabin site based on the availability of stone for constructing one. The fire was rarely allowed to go out, especially during winter months, since reigniting it with flint and steel could be tedious. Embers smouldered constantly, keeping the room warm and ready for cooking. The scent of wood smoke permeated everything, clothing, bedding, and food alike. Cooking implements were simple but functional. An iron kettle or pot hung over the fire, suspended from a metal hook or a wooden crane that could swing in and out of the flames. Frying pans, often carried from trading posts, were invaluable. For many meals, stews or porridges dominated, combining whatever meat, grain, or root vegetables were available. The walls of the cabin might hold wooden shelves where dried herbs, strips of meat, or bundles of maize were stored. Some men carved simple wooden utensils by hand, while others used items obtained through trade. The diet was not luxurious, but the cabin kitchen was efficient, turning wild ingredients into sustenance. Furnishings were minimal, yet mountain men demonstrated remarkable creativity in crafting what they needed. Beds were usually simple frames built into the wall, covered with animal pelts or straw. Bears, elk, or buffalo hides served as blankets and mattresses. Chairs and stools were often nothing more than stumps or rough-hewn planks. A table, when present, was small and functional, perhaps fashioned from split logs. The interior might appear sparse to modern eyes, but each object carried a story of necessity, effort, and adaptation. Lighting was scarce. Windows were small and often lacked glass, instead being covered with oiled cloth, animal hide, or thin paper to allow in a little daylight while keeping out wind. At night, firelight provided the main source of illumination. Tallow candles or small oil lamps might be used, though these required resources that were not always easy to come by. Shadows danced across log walls, creating an atmosphere that could feel both cozy and claustrophobic. Storage was a constant challenge. Mountain men accumulated items essential for survival: tools, traps, weapons, and supplies. These had to be carefully organised within the limited space. Rifles were often hung on pegs near the door for quick access. Powder horns, bullet moulds, and cleaning kits were kept close by. Knives and hatchets might be tucked into shelves or hung from wall hooks. Skins and furs, when drying or being prepared for trade, could be stretched along the interior walls, filling the cabin with the musky scent of rawhide. In many ways, the cabin doubled as both living quarters and workshop. Personal touches, however modest, were also found inside. A man might carve decorative patterns into a wooden beam, or fashion a pipe rack from antlers. Trinkets obtained from native trade partners, beads, feathers, or small ornaments, sometimes adorned the walls. These touches reflected not just utility, but a human desire for comfort and identity, even in isolation. For many, the cabin was more than shelter. It was a statement of independence and a tangible result of survival skills. The cabin also functioned as a social space. Though many mountain men lived alone, gatherings were not uncommon. Trappers might spend nights together, sharing food and stories around the hearth. Laughter, songs, and tales of adventure filled the smoky air. When winter storms raged outside, companionship became a defense against loneliness and despair. Cabins thus served not only as individual shelters, but as temporary centres of community in the wilderness. Of course, life inside was not without hardship. Vermin, mice, insects, and sometimes snakes found their way into cracks and corners. The constant smoke could irritate eyes and lungs. In summer, cabins grew stiflingly hot, and in winter, bitterly cold draughts could still find their way in despite careful chinking. The air was often heavy with the mingled scents of sweat, smoke, hides, and food. Yet these were accepted realities. Comfort was defined differently on the frontier. For men accustomed to long months in the open wilderness, the cabin offered security unmatched by tents or temporary shelters. It was a place to store goods safely, to recover from illness or injury, and to plan the next trapping season. The psychological value of having four walls and a roof should not be underestimated. In a land where danger lurked in weather, wildlife, and human encounters, the cabin symbolised stability. Over time, as some mountain men transitioned into more settled lives, cabins grew slightly more elaborate. Floors were improved, furniture expanded, and families added their own touches. But the essence remained the same: a space built from raw materials by one's own hands, adapted to the demands of wilderness life. The cabins of the mountain men became prototypes for the log homes of settlers who would follow, influencing architectural traditions across the frontier. Thus, inside the cabin, one finds the true intersection of human necessity and creativity. Each log and tool, each piece of furniture, and each flicker of firelight told a story of resilience. The mountain man's cabin was not simply a house, it was an ecosystem, a survival workshop, and a reflection of the human will to endure and adapt. In its simplicity, it captured the essence of frontier life, where every object served a purpose, and every choice was dictated by the realities of living on the edge of civilization. If the log cabin represented the mountain man's anchor, then the vast wilderness surrounding it was his true domain. A cabin alone could not sustain life, it merely provided shelter. To endure the rigours of the frontier, mountain men relied on an intricate web of survival skills honed through necessity, experience, and often knowledge borrowed from Native American neighbours. These skills extended far beyond carpentry or building. They encompassed hunting, trapping, food preservation, navigation, herbal medicine, and countless other forms of practical ingenuity that transformed the wilderness from a hostile environment into a livable, though still dangerous, home. Hunting was one of the most fundamental survival skills. Firearms, particularly long rifles, gave the mountain men an advantage. But success depended less on technology and more on patience, stealth, and an intimate understanding of animal behaviour. Deer, elk, and bison provided meat, while smaller game such as rabbits or turkeys often filled the pot when larger prey proved scarce. Tracks in the snow or mud revealed recent activity, and experienced trappers could identify the species, size, and even the likely direction of travel from a single print. For many, the hunt was not only about food but also about clothing and trade. A single buffalo, for example, could supply hides for warmth, sinew for bowstrings or thread, and bones for tools. Nothing was wasted. Trapping, though, was the true economic backbone of many mountain men's lives. Beavers in particular were in high demand during the early 19th century, when the European fashion for felt hats drove a lucrative trade in pelts. Setting traps required technical precision. Steel traps were carefully positioned along streams or riverbanks, baited or camouflaged with mud and leaves. The placement was critical. Too shallow and the trap might be spotted, too deep and it might be useless. Checking traps was a daily task, often carried out in bitter weather. Success meant valuable furs, but failure could spell hunger or financial ruin. These skills demanded a deep knowledge of animal habits and seasonal cycles, making the trapper as much a student of ecology as a labourer. Beyond hunting and trapping, foraging was essential. The wilderness offered edible roots, berries and nuts, but knowing which plants were safe could mean the difference between life and death. Many mountain men adopted Native American knowledge of edible species. Wild onions, camas bulbs, and berries such as choke cherries supplemented their diet. Some plants doubled as medicine. Willow bark containing natural salicin was used to ease pain and reduce fevers. Yarrow might be applied to wounds, while mint could soothe stomach ailments. This herbal knowledge, though rudimentary, extended the frontier man's ability to cope with illness in the absence of doctors. Food preservation presented another challenge. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, especially in summer, so drying, smoking or salting became essential techniques. Strips of venison or buffalo hung near the hearth or over an outdoor fire, dried into jerky that could last for months. Pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat and sometimes berries, borrowed from native traditions, provided a calorie-dense staple that sustained long journeys. Storing these provisions required careful planning, as marauding animals or simple spoilage could wipe out weeks of effort. A cabin's rafters might be strung with strips of meat or bags of dried grain, where smoke and heat discouraged pests. Navigation skills were equally vital. Mountain men traversed vast landscapes without maps or roads. They relied on natural landmarks, the bend of a river, the shape of a mountain peak, or the alignment of stars at night. A keen eye for terrain allowed them to retrace steps or locate hidden camps. Some carried rudimentary compasses, but many trusted instinct and experience. Getting lost could be deadly, and so memory, observation and orientation became as important as any weapon or tool. Fire-making was another cornerstone of survival. While most cabins maintained a perpetual fire, men often travelled far from home and needed to kindle flames in the open. Flint and steel, when struck together, produced sparks that could ignite dry tinder such as moss, shavings or charred cloth. The skill lay not only in sparking flame but in nurturing it to life, coaxing embers into steady heat. In wet conditions, this required ingenuity, splitting damp logs to find dry heartwood, or carrying tinder bundles in waterproof pouches. A fire provided warmth, cooked food, and warded off predators, making it one of the most essential survival skills. The crafting of tools and repairs was constant. Axes dulled, rifle parts broke, traps bent. A mountain man who could not mend his gear risked helplessness. Blacksmithing was not practical in the wilderness, but improvisation often filled the gap. A knife blade might be sharpened on a stone, broken straps replaced with strips of rawhide, or worn moccasins patched with sinew. Many men carried small kits of awls, needles and files, allowing them to extend the life of their equipment. Resourcefulness, rather than abundance, defined survival. Equally important were defensive skills. The frontier was unpredictable. Predators, hostile encounters, or sudden accidents demanded readiness. Rifles were essential, but so too were awareness and caution. A poorly stored powder horn could mean disaster if dampness ruined the charge. Careful cleaning after each use ensured firearms would not fail when most needed. Situational awareness, listening for unusual sounds, noting changes in animal behaviour, or spotting fresh tracks, often alerted men to dangers long before they arrived. Interactions with Native American tribes added another dimension to survival. Some encounters were hostile, others cooperative. Many mountain men adopted native techniques for hunting, dressing hides, or building temporary shelters. Snowshoes, canoes, and clothing styles such as buckskin were often learned from indigenous models. These exchanges highlight how survival was not a matter of solitary genius, but a blending of cultural knowledge. Without such borrowed skills, the mountain men's success would have been far more limited. Finally, survival demanded psychological endurance. Isolation, harsh weather, and constant uncertainty weighed heavily on even the toughest individuals. Loneliness was a formidable adversary, one that drove some men to madness or reckless behaviour. Coping strategies varied. Some turned to storytelling, carving notches into cabin walls to track time, or crafting small objects to ward off boredom. Others found solace in periodic gatherings, such as the famed rendezvous, where mountain men traded furs, restocked supplies, and enjoyed camaraderie. These events were as much about mental renewal as economic exchange, providing a reminder that even in the wilderness human beings craved connection. Taken together, these skills illustrate the comprehensive survival system that defined the mountain man's life. He was hunter, trapper, herbalist, craftsman, navigator, and psychologist all in one. Each day presented new tests, finding food, preserving resources, repairing gear, and avoiding danger. The cabin might have been his shelter, but the wilderness was his classroom, and survival was a curriculum with no end. These men did not simply live in the wild. They adapted, innovated, and endured through an extraordinary range of abilities. The survival skills of the mountain men left a lasting legacy. Many techniques, jerky making, fire starting, hide tanning, would be carried forward by pioneers and settlers. Others entered the realm of folklore romanticized in stories of rugged independence. Yet at their core, these skills were not about heroism, but necessity. The ability to turn a dangerous wilderness into a functioning home was what distinguished those who thrived from those who perished. In the end, the survival of the mountain men was not merely a matter of strength or courage, but of knowledge applied daily in the face of relentless challenge. For all their reputation as solitary figures, mountain men did not live in isolation from the wider human world. The wilderness was inhabited not only by animals and harsh landscapes, but also by diverse Native American tribes, rival trappers, traders, and eventually settlers pushing westward. The story of the mountain men is, therefore, not merely one of rugged self-sufficiency, but of constant interaction, sometimes peaceful, sometimes violent, with others who shared or contested the same frontier spaces. These encounters shaped their survival, their culture, and their ultimate legacy. One of the most defining relationships of the mountain men's lives was with Native Americans. Indigenous tribes had lived in the Rocky Mountains and surrounding plains for centuries, developing extensive knowledge of the land's resources and rhythms. For newcomers, such expertise was indispensable. Many mountain men learned directly from native teachers how to identify edible plants, craft snowshoes, navigate river routes, and even build more effective shelters. The adoption of moccasins and buckskin clothing, for example, was a direct borrowing from native traditions, providing better durability and comfort than European-style boots in rugged terrain. Trade was the foundation of many of these exchanges. Furs trapped by mountain men, particularly beaver pelts, were highly valued by Euro-American markets, but native tribes also played a crucial role in supplying pelts. In return, mountain men and traders offered goods such as metal tools, firearms, cloth, beads, and other manufactured items. These trade relationships could be mutually beneficial, enhancing the survival strategies of both sides. A steel knife or kettle could transform daily tasks for native households, just as native-made snowshoes or guidance through mountain passes could determine life or death for trappers. Yet, such encounters were not always harmonious. Competition for resources, misunderstandings, and the broader context of US expansion often brought conflict. Some tribes viewed the mountain men as intruders or threats, while others forged alliances. Individual personalities mattered greatly. A respectful trapper might be welcomed, while a reckless one could spark hostility. Stories abound of cabins burned, traps destroyed, or lone trappers ambushed. At the same time, there are accounts of deep friendships, even kinship, as some mountain men married native women and became integrated into tribal communities. These marriages were not only personal unions, but also political alliances that helped establish trust and cooperation. Language barriers were often overcome through adaptation. Mountain men developed a frontier jargon, mixing English, French, Spanish, and native words into a rough but functional pidgin. Gestures, signs, and shared experiences filled the gaps. The famed Plains Indian Sign Language became a common tool for communication across linguistic boundaries, enabling trade and negotiation even where spoken languages diverged. This blending of tongues reflected the cultural intermingling that defined much of the frontier experience. Beyond native interactions, mountain men also encountered rival trappers from other nations. French-Canadian voyageurs, British traders linked to the Hudson's Bay Company, and Spanish or Mexican settlers all competed for fur resources. This competition sometimes turned violent, but it also spurred ingenuity. Mountain men learned to adapt their techniques, adopt new trade routes, and seize opportunities wherever they arose. Rivalry was fierce, but cooperation was not unheard of, especially when survival demanded it. Sharing a fire on a winter night could mean the difference between life and death, regardless of national allegiance. One of the most significant forms of exchange came through the annual rendezvous. Beginning in the 1820s, fur trading companies organised these great gatherings, often held in mountain valleys accessible to both trappers and native tribes. For mountain men, the rendezvous was more than a marketplace. It was a lifeline. Here they traded a year's worth of pelts for powder, lead, cloth, coffee, sugar, and whiskey. They reconnected with old friends, shared news, and revelled in rare moments of festivity. Native tribes also participated, exchanging horses, hides, and crafted goods for manufactured items. The rendezvous symbolized the interconnectedness of frontier life, blending cultures in a swirl of commerce, storytelling, and celebration. At these gatherings, cultural exchange went hand in hand with economic activity. Mountain men witnessed dances, rituals, and games of their native counterparts, while tribes observed the strange habits of the Euro-American trappers. Marriages were often arranged during rendezvous, further intertwining the two worlds. Alcohol, unfortunately, was another form of exchange. Whiskey flowed freely at these events, sometimes leading to conflict, exploitation, and long-term social disruption within native communities. The rendezvous thus reflected both the opportunities and perils of cross-cultural contact. Religion and spirituality also entered the sphere of exchange. While most mountain men did not practice organized religion in the wilderness, they encountered native spiritual traditions and occasionally blended them with their own beliefs. Ceremonial practices, taboos regarding hunting, or respect for certain landscapes influenced the behavior of trappers. Conversely, missionaries who later followed settlers westward sought to convert both native peoples and scattered trappers, adding another layer of cultural interaction. The mountain men's role as intermediaries cannot be overstated. They often acted as translators, guides, and mediators between native tribes and encroaching settlers or government agents. Their knowledge of both cultures gave them a unique, if precarious, position. Some used this role to foster cooperation, while others exploited it for personal gain. Either way, their encounters helped shape the broader narrative of westward expansion, for better or worse. It is also important to recognize how these exchanges changed the mountain men themselves. Many entered the wilderness as young men seeking wealth or adventure, only to emerge years later transformed by the cultures they encountered. Their dress, language, and habits bore little resemblance to their origins in eastern towns. Some chose never to return, instead fully adopting native lifestyles. Others straddled both worlds, embodying the hybrid identity of frontier intermediaries. Yet, these encounters were not timeless. As the 1830s and 1840s unfolded, the beaver trade declined, and with it the prominence of the mountain men. Native tribes faced increasing pressure from expanding settlement and military campaigns. The delicate balance of cooperation and exchange gave way to dispossession and conflict on a larger scale. Still, the era of the mountain men left behind stories, relationships, and legacies that testified to a brief but intense chapter of cultural blending in North America's history. In sum, the mountain men's world was defined as much by their human interactions as by their solitary labours. Their cabins and survival skills provided the framework for life, but encounters with native tribes, rival trappers, and trading partners gave that life meaning, danger, and opportunity. They were not merely loners battling the wilderness. They were participants in a complex network of exchanges that wove together cultures, economies, and histories. These encounters remind us that the frontier was never empty. It was always shared, contested, and reshaped by those who lived within it. The mountain men, once the quintessential figures of the North American frontier, enjoyed only a brief but vivid period of prominence. From the early 1800s through the mid-1830s, they roamed the Rocky Mountains and beyond, trapping beaver, exploring uncharted territory, and forging relationships with native tribes. Yet by the 1840s, the era was drawing to a close. The decline of the mountain men was not caused by a single event, but by the convergence of economic shifts, environmental changes, geopolitical forces, and the relentless advance of American settlement. Understanding this decline reveals much about how frontier economies evolve and how individuals once central to expansion can so quickly fade into obscurity. The most immediate factor in the mountain men's decline was the collapse of the beaver fur trade. For decades, beaver pelts had been the lifeblood of the frontier economy, driving expeditions and justifying the hardships of wilderness living. But fashions in Europe, which had fueled the demand, began to change in the 1830s. The once ubiquitous beaver felt hat fell out of favour, replaced by silk hats that were lighter, more stylish, and cheaper to produce. The demand for beaver pelts plummeted almost overnight, undercutting the very foundation of the mountain man's livelihood. A trapper who once could exchange a year's harvest for vital supplies suddenly found his furs devalued, his economic role diminished. Environmental depletion compounded this decline. Intensive trapping over decades had severely reduced beaver populations in many river systems. Streams that had once teemed with beaver lodges grew quiet, forcing trappers to push deeper into unexplored regions for fewer returns. The long, dangerous journeys yielded diminishing profits, making the life of a trapper increasingly unsustainable. In effect, the mountain men had become victims of their own success, overexploiting the resource that had sustained them. Meanwhile, the structure of the fur trade itself was shifting. Large companies like the Hudson's Bay Company and the American Fur Company dominated the trade, employing strategies and resources far beyond the reach of independent trappers. These corporations centralized operations, focusing on efficiency, permanent posts, and large-scale logistics. By contrast, the lone mountain man, operating with minimal support and enormous personal risk, seemed increasingly antiquated. Even the Great Rendezvous, once the beating heart of the fur trade, declined in significance as trading companies redirected business toward fixed outposts and river-based transport networks. Geopolitical developments also reshaped the landscape. As the United States expanded westward, treaties, land purchases, and military campaigns brought new authority to frontier regions. Government surveys, forts, and emigrant trails began carving permanent routes through what had once been the exclusive domain of mountain men. The Oregon Trail, for instance, opened a flood of settlers into territories previously known only to trappers and native peoples. These settlers did not seek furs but farmland, introducing a new vision of the land that left little space for the mountain man's itinerant lifestyle. Encounters with native tribes also became more fraught. During the heyday of the fur trade, mountain men had often coexisted with or even integrated into tribal societies. But as settler expansion accelerated, conflict between native tribes and the US government intensified. Mountain men, who had once acted as intermediaries, now found themselves marginalized in an escalating struggle between two much larger forces. The trust and mutual exchanges that had once characterized relationships with tribes grew increasingly fragile, overshadowed by the advance of settler colonialism. The decline of the mountain men was also a cultural transformation. Many of the individuals who had once defined themselves by wilderness independence were forced to adapt to new roles. Some became guides for emigrant wagon trains, using their hard-earned knowledge of trails, rivers, and passes to lead settlers westward. Famous figures like Kit Carson transitioned from trapping to guiding, scouting, and even serving as intermediaries for the US Army. Others entered the trading business, established ranches, or assimilated into native communities. A few, unable to adapt, faded into obscurity, their skills obsolete in a rapidly changing world. One of the most telling markers of this transformation was the death of the rendezvous system. First organised in the 1820s, the rendezvous had epitomized the mountain man's culture, a mix of trade fair, festival, and social reunion. By the late 1830s, the economic logic that sustained these gatherings collapsed. The last great rendezvous took place in 1840, marking the symbolic end of the fur-trapping golden age. Without this annual focal point, mountain men lost not only their commercial centre, but also the communal identity that had defined their world. The romantic image of the mountain man began to diverge from the reality of his decline. Eastern audiences, hungry for tales of adventure, devoured dime novels and frontier sketches that painted trappers as heroic explorers and fearless hunters. Artists like George Catlin and Alfred Jacob Miller immortalized their rugged clothing, their dramatic landscapes, and their encounters with native peoples. Yet by the time these images reached popular culture, the actual mountain man was already vanishing from the wilderness. In many cases, the myth outlived the man, creating a legacy of frontier ruggedness that obscured the economic and environmental realities of decline. The decline of the mountain men was not purely a story of loss. In many ways, their role in exploration and survival laid the groundwork for the westward expansion that followed. The trails they blazed, the maps they sketched, and the knowledge they accumulated about geography, flora, fauna, and indigenous cultures became invaluable to the settlers, soldiers, and officials who came after them. In guiding wagon trains or serving as scouts, former mountain men helped knit together the expanding United States, even as they sacrificed the independence that had once defined their lives. By the mid-19th century, the archetype of the mountain man lingered mostly as a cultural memory. A handful of old trappers still lived in remote cabins, but their numbers dwindled and their relevance faded. The frontier was no longer a space for solitary fur trappers, but for settlers, farmers, miners, and railroads. The wilderness they had once claimed as their own was absorbed into the march of a nation, leaving behind only echoes of their presence. In retrospect, the decline of the mountain men illustrates the fragility of frontier economies built on a single resource. The rise and fall of the fur trade was swift, leaving those who had staked their lives on it scrambling to reinvent themselves. It also demonstrates the ways in which cultural legends can persist long after the practical realities have disappeared. Though the mountain men ceased to dominate the wilderness by the 1840s, their mythic image endured, shaping America's understanding of its frontier past. Thus, the decline of the mountain men was not an abrupt disappearance but a gradual transformation. Driven by economic collapse, environmental exhaustion, corporate competition, settler expansion, and cultural shifts, the men who had once symbolized the very edge of civilization adapted or perished in the face of change. Their cabins rotted, their rendezvous ceased, and their traps rusted, but their stories lived on. The era ended, but the idea of the mountain man remained, a bridge between a vanishing wilderness and a rapidly industrializing nation. The era of the mountain men was brief, spanning scarcely more than 2 decades in the early 19th century. Yet, its legacy has far outlasted the men themselves, leaving an indelible mark on American culture, history, and identity. Though their economic foundation collapsed with the decline of the fur trade, the mountain men became more than trappers and traders. They evolved into symbols of frontier freedom, guides of westward expansion, and enduring figures in the mythology of the American West. Their legacy is complex, blending reality with legend, hardship with heroism, and environmental exploitation with exploration. The most immediate legacy of the mountain men was geographic knowledge. At a time when much of the Rocky Mountain region remained unmapped, mountain men traversed rivers, crossed mountain passes, and recorded details of terrain that would prove invaluable to future settlers and government expeditions. Figures like Jedediah Smith, who crossed the Great Basin and the Sierra Nevada, or Jim Bridger, who discovered the pass that would later bear his name, expanded the boundaries of what was known to Euro-American audiences. Their first-hand knowledge of trails, water sources, and seasonal conditions turned wilderness into navigable routes. This information laid the groundwork for the Great Migration trails of the mid-19th century, including the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. In this sense, the mountain men acted as pioneers of pioneers, their paths later followed by thousands of emigrants. Equally significant was their role as cultural intermediaries. Living for years at a time in native lands, mountain men adapted to indigenous ways of survival, from building shelters to curing hides to navigating vast landscapes. Many married native women, forging kinship ties that bridged 2 worlds. While their presence also brought disruption, disease, and eventual displacement to indigenous peoples, the mountain men were among the few Euro-Americans who learned from and often respected native traditions. Their hybrid existence helped transfer knowledge across cultural boundaries, enriching both survival skills and ethnographic understanding. The image of the mountain man also became a powerful symbol of independence. In an age when the United States was transforming from a fledgling republic into an industrializing nation, mountain men embodied rugged self-reliance and resistance to conformity. Clad in buckskin, armed with rifle and knife, and unmoored from the rules of settled society, they represented a romantic alternative to the encroaching modern world. For Americans anxious about urbanization and industrial growth, the mountain man came to symbolize freedom, masculinity, and authenticity. This cultural legacy extended far beyond their economic role, shaping literature, art, and even political rhetoric in the decades that followed. Yet the legacy was not without contradictions. The mountain men's success depended on extracting natural resources, primarily beaver, at unsustainable levels. By the time the fur trade collapsed, entire ecosystems had been altered. Beaver dams, once abundant, had regulated waterways, provided habitats for fish, and shaped landscapes. Their near extirpation changed river systems and local ecologies. The mountain men thus contributed both to the opening of the West and to its early environmental degradation. This paradox complicates their memory. They were explorers and preservers of knowledge, yet also participants in destructive exploitation. Their role in westward expansion also has an ambivalent legacy. By blazing trails and guiding settlers, mountain men facilitated the movement of tens of thousands of emigrants. This expansion, in turn, accelerated the displacement of native peoples, whose lands were overrun by farming, railroads, and military campaigns. Some mountain men themselves mourned this transformation, recognizing that the wilderness which had sustained them was vanishing under the plough. Yet others actively supported, even profited from, the settler advance, working as scouts for the US Army or as interpreters during treaty negotiations. In this way, their legacy intertwines with both the triumph and the tragedy of America's westward push. The cultural afterlife of the mountain men perhaps overshadows their historical reality. During the mid to late 19th century, popular writers transformed trappers into larger-than-life heroes. Dime novels, frontier sketches, and romanticized biographies exaggerated their exploits, portraying them as fearless conquerors of the wilderness. Painters and illustrators, such as Alfred Jacob Miller and later Frederick Remington, depicted them in dramatic landscapes, often emphasizing their solitude and bravery. These depictions blended truth with imagination, creating a mythic archetype of the frontier adventurer that persists even today. In the 20th century, the mountain man legend found new life in film and folklore. Hollywood westerns and adventure novels continued to glorify their independence, sometimes ignoring the harsher realities of poverty, violence, and cultural complexity. At the same time, historical reenactments, mountain man rendezvous festivals, and outdoor enthusiasts embraced the skills and crafts associated with trapping culture, muzzle-loading rifles, buckskin clothing, and survival techniques. These modern revivals reveal the continuing allure of the mountain man as a symbol of authenticity in a world increasingly distant from wilderness living. The legacy of the mountain men also endures in place, names and geography. Rivers, passes, and valleys across the Rockies bear the names of trappers and scouts. Bridger Pass, Sublette County, and Kit Carson County preserve the memory of individuals whose paths shaped the settlement of the West. Their stories are embedded in the very landscape they once roamed, ensuring that even as their lifestyle vanished, their presence remains inscribed on maps. On a deeper level, the mountain men's legacy is a meditation on change. Their rise and decline illustrate the fleeting nature of frontier economies, dependent on global markets and vulnerable to shifting fashions. They remind us that cultural icons can be born of hardship, mythologized in memory, and reimagined across generations. The mountain men's rugged image, half reality, half legend, became part of America's national identity, symbolizing both the allure and the cost of taming the wilderness. For historians, the mountain men remain subjects of fascination not only for what they accomplished, but for what they represent. They were men caught between worlds, between native and settler, wilderness and civilization, solitude and commerce. Their lives tell us much about resilience, adaptation, and the costs of exploitation. Their legacy challenges us to see both the romance and the reality, the myth and the history. In conclusion, the mountain men left behind more than pelts and trails. They gave the United States a vision of rugged individualism, a body of geographic knowledge, and a cultural archetype that has endured for 2 centuries. At the same time, their story warns of the fragility of resources, the consequences of overexploitation, and the complexities of cultural encounters on contested frontiers. Their legacy is both inspiring and cautionary, both celebrated and sobering. The mountain men era ended long ago, but the idea of the mountain man lives on, in place names and stories and festivals, and in the national imagination. They remain reminders of a time when the wilderness still seemed endless, when survival demanded ingenuity, and when the line between myth and history blurred under the vast sky of the American West. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the rugged world of the mountain men. As the firelight of their cabins fades, I hope the echoes of their resilience and resourcefulness bring you a sense of calm tonight. Let me know in the comments what part of the world you're listening from, and if you'd like more gentle history told in this way, don't forget to subscribe and return for the next quiet story.